Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. The 31st of January 2025 marked the 5-year anniversary of Brexit, the date when the UK officially left the European Union trading agreement forever. And this was obviously a big moment for the UK economy because it had been a member of the EU since 1973. So in today's video, I want to take a look at what's happened in that 5-year period. Has Brexit delivered all of the promises that the Leave campaign put forward to the people of the UK, or has it been a negative? Has it actually dragged down the UK economy? So let's start off by talking about why the UK wanted to leave the European Union in the first place. At face value, being a member of a no-tariff trade agreement is a real positive for all of the companies within your economy because it means that they can export their goods and services to lots of different countries without having any additional costs added. And that's one of the main drivers why the UK joined the EU in the first place. It also meant that the UK could source cheaper imports from all of those other countries, didn't have to pay any additional taxes. So there was a double benefit in terms of trade. But the problem with the EU over time is that as it grew and its expenses grew and its bureaucracy became more involved, the UK had to contribute a larger and larger proportion of those costs because as one of the biggest economies in the world, it was expected to stump up a larger cheque than a lot of the other smaller countries. And the UK started subsidising some of those younger countries that were joining the EU over time as it grew and grew. And this became a bone of contention in the UK. And back in the 1990s, a political party was formed campaigning for the UK to leave the European Union. Now, back in those days, that party didn't have much funding and it didn't really have much support. However, over time, the popularity of that party started to grow. And by 2004, the UK Independence Party, or UKIP as it was called by then, actually recorded the third best result in the European Parliament elections in the UK. It gained 12 seats and 2.6 million votes. And so people started to hear about UKIP, and it then got a lot of famous people starting to join and support the party. And by 2014, it had actually grown in popularity, and the number of seats that it held in the European Parliament grew to 24, and it actually started to take seats in the local government elections and gained its first member of Parliament. And at this time, the UK was in political turmoil. The Conservative Party, which was the leading party in the country at the time, failed to gain an overall majority and so had to form a coalition with another party. And so David Cameron, who was the leader of the Conservatives at that time, was hearing from a lot of his backbenchers that they were concerned that they were going to lose their seat at the next general election to UKIP. And as a result of the mounting pressure, David Cameron announced that he was going to hold a once-in-a-lifetime referendum for the people of the UK to vote whether or not they wanted to stay in the European Union or whether they wanted to leave. And on the 23rd of June 2016, 51.89% of the UK population said that they wanted the UK to leave the European Union forever. So Brexit was done and the UK was out of the EU. Now, as a direct result of the Brexit vote going against him, David Cameron resigned as the Prime Minister of the UK and was replaced by Theresa May. But unfortunately, from Theresa May's point of view, she couldn't get the Brexit deal done because of Northern Ireland. The UK actually has a physical land border with the European Union in Ireland, the split between the south and the north. And this became a really difficult issue to get around because the UK didn't want to have a hard border between the north and the south because of all of the troubles that had been going on in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s in the UK. Theresa May repeatedly failed to get her Brexit deal approved, and eventually she left as the leader of the party and was replaced by Boris Johnson, who did get the deal done on the 31st of January 2020. Now, it's often been said that the people of the UK didn't really know what they were voting for when they were voting to either stay in the European Union or leave. What were they actually talking about? Was this an economic decision or was this down to immigration? And immigration actually became one of the big topics in terms of how the Leave vote was put forward. And the highest profile individual associated with the Leave campaign was Nigel Farage. and he was seen standing in front of a poster of thousands of immigrants queuing at the border for the UK. And so a lot of people started to talk about Brexit in terms of stopping immigration, trying to stop people coming into the UK. Now, in terms of assessing the impact on immigration that Brexit has had, this chart, which is provided by the Office of National Statistics, looks at the long-term net migration to the UK between June 2012 and June 2024. The scale on the left-hand side of this chart measures the number of people and goes from minus 100,000 at the bottom, so that would be net emigration, 100,000 people leaving the UK, to plus 800,000 at the top, so that would indicate 800,000 moving to the UK. And we've got four different coloured lines here. The purple line at the bottom shows the number of British people moving back to the UK from overseas. The dark blue line shows the number of people moving to the UK from non-European Union countries. The light blue line shows the number of people moving from the European Union, and the green line is the total. So if we start off by looking at what happened between 2012 and 2016, which was when the Brexit vote took place. If we look at the green line, which shows the total number of people moving to the UK, you can see that there was a general increase from around 175,000 in June 2012 to around 300,000 by June 2016. And if we look at the breakdown of that, you can see that on average around 50,000 Britons were leaving the UK, so they were emigrating, that's shown by the purple line below the zero line. The number of people moving to the UK from non-EU countries remained relatively stable at around 70,000 per year. However, the number of people moving to the UK from the EU increased over that period from around 190,000 to roughly 300,000. So at the time of the Brexit vote, the main source of immigration into the UK was coming from the European Union. Now, as we've just discussed, it actually took 3.5 years to agree some sort of deal for Brexit. And as you can see from the vertical dotted line on the far right-hand side of this chart, the new immigration system wasn't actually introduced until 2021. So if we have a look at what happened between the Brexit vote and the introduction of that new system, you can see that total net immigration fell from around 300,000 per year to around 100,000, and the biggest reduction was coming from the EU. It saw a fall from around 300,000 to less than 100,000. If we now have a look at what's happened since the Brexit deal was done and the new immigration system was put into place, you can see that there has been a huge increase in net immigration to the UK, and in 2023 the figure rose to more than 900,000 people, which is 3 times the figure of 300,000 at the time of the Brexit vote in 2016. And if we look at the breakdown of that, you can see that there's been an explosion in non-EU immigration. It's increased from around 100,000 in June 2020 to almost 1 million in June 23. And interestingly, that figure's been offset by what's happened with people from the EU, where there's actually been net emigration from the UK. EU citizens have been leaving the UK. And in terms of looking at where those non-EU citizens are coming from, this chart provided by the Office of National Statistics for the year to June 24 shows that the biggest source is India, with over 200,000 people moving to the UK in that year, followed by Nigeria, with over 100,000, Pakistan with around 100,000, China with just under 100,000, and Zimbabwe was the 5th largest contributor with around 40,000. And in terms of assessing why people are emigrating to the UK, the biggest single driver in the year to June 23 was for studying. Around 425,000 people moved for that purpose. The second biggest factor was for work, with over 350,000 people moving to the UK. The third biggest factor, with around 120,000 people, was for humanitarian reasons, followed by asylum seekers, with around 90,000, and to join family, which came in at a similar figure. And if you look at the projected figures, which are shown by the dotted lines for 2024, you can see that work is now the biggest driver, bringing in over 400,000 people, and study-related emigration is expected to come down to around 375,000. One of the biggest issues put forward by the Leave campaign at the time of the Brexit vote was the amount of money that the UK was contributing to the European Union. And Boris Johnson, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time, was quoted as saying that the UK was paying £350 million per week. and a bus toured the UK saying, let's pay that £350 million to the NHS. And this became a big topic of conversation because the NHS was struggling for cash and needed more funding. And so a lot of people were saying, well, let's vote for leave and then the NHS will be saved. Now, in order to assess what the impact of Brexit has been on the National Health Service in the UK, I thought it was worth having a look at this chart, which shows total spending on the NHS between 2010 and the forecast levels for 2025. And what this chart shows is that in 2016, which was the year of the Brexit vote, the total amount spent on the NHS was £142.1 billion. Now, as we've discussed, the Brexit deal didn't actually happen until January 2020. And you can see that in 2021, there was a large increase in the amount of money spent on the NHS. It rose to above £200 billion. However, as you can also see, the reason for that increase was the emergency caused by COVID-19 pandemic. So this wasn't a scheduled budgeted increase. This was simply down to the fact that lots of people in the UK were dying from COVID, and so the NHS needed to have a huge injection of cash to be able to try to cope with everything that was happening. And that carried on in 2022 because it took a long time to get rid of all of the COVID in the UK. So if we have a look at the figures for 2023, you can see that the total amount spent increased to £185.4 billion, which represented an increase of £43 billion against the figure from 2016. However, as you can also see, this again was a slight hangover of the COVID-19 period, and the estimated spending in 2024 was down to £177.9 billion. And in fact, if you take a step back and look at the shape of this chart and exclude the exceptional period for COVID, you can see that the growth in spending on the NHS has pretty much continued at the same sort of level as it has historically. So there hasn't really been any major boost from Brexit in terms of the amount of money going to the National Health Service. So if the NHS hasn't received additional funding of £350 million per day, or around £18 billion per year, what's happened to the money that the UK has saved from leaving the European Union? Well, in order to work that out, let's have a look at what the actual contributions that the UK were making to the EU were. In June 2022, the UK government published this document, which detailed the UK's contribution to the EU budget. And this chart shows a breakdown of that contribution between 1973 and 2020. And the scale on the left-hand side of this chart goes from minus £15 billion at the bottom to plus £25 billion at the top. And we've got four different constituent parts here. The green bars show the gross contribution that the UK made to the European Union. The purple bars beneath the zero line shows the rebate or refund that the UK received each year. And the lilac section at the bottom shows the money that was received in the UK from the European Union. So basically the grants and other distributions that were made by the EU to the UK as a member state. So if we start off by looking at the green bars, you can see that back in 1973, the UK contributed around £2 billion to the EU budget. And over the following 47 years, that figure increased consistently and rose to around £23 billion by 2020. If we now have a look at how much the UK received, either as part of its membership or through rebates, you can see that between 1973 and 2000, there was a general increase in the amount, rising from around £1 billion in 1973 to around £12 billion in 2000. However, if you look at the period between 2000 and 2020, you can see that there was a general reduction in the amount that the UK was receiving. And so the net contribution, which is shown by the green dash on the green bar charts, started to increase. And by 2020, the net contribution of around £13 billion was the highest that it had been at any time in the UK's history. So I think the big question in today's video is what's been happening with UK trade? What's happened now that the UK is no longer part of that no tariff agreement with all of the other EU countries? This chart shows the quarterly movement in UK exports to the European Union between 2010 and 2024. Now this chart is actually an index. You can see on the left hand side the scale goes from 0 to 100, and the benchmark of 100 has been taken from the fourth quarter of 2020. And we've got two different coloured lines here. The red line shows the amount of goods that the UK has been exporting to the EU, and the blue line shows the amount of services. And what this chart clearly shows is that since the UK left the European Union, the amount of goods that it's exporting, so physical product that it's exporting to the European Union, has fallen. However, interestingly, the amount of services that it's exporting has risen. Now, I think the reason for that is that some of the services that were previously being provided by the UK to the rest of the EU are still needed by those European countries. They can't replicate things that exist in the London market, for example. And so European countries have had to start importing them rather than doing it through overseas offices of UK businesses. Now, in terms of assessing the financial impact of Brexit on the UK economy, this table, which has been provided by the UK government in terms of their impact assessment, looks at the positives and negatives of the Brexit trade deals. And what this shows is that the new deal that's been put in place with the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, which consists of Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam, has provided a positive boost of around £2 billion per year to the UK economy. The new deal with Australia has provided a £2.3 billion boost. The new deal with New Zealand has provided an £80 million boost. The potential deal with the USA is estimated to provide somewhere between £1.6 and £3.4 billion boost to the economy. However, I think that was estimated before Donald Trump came into power and said that he was going to apply tariffs against everybody, so it remains to be seen whether or not that actually transpires. A potential deal between the UK and India is estimated to add somewhere between £3.3 and £6.2 billion to the UK economy, so all of this is all very good. However, the impact of Brexit is estimated to have had a negative £100 billion impact on the UK economy. So overall here, the impact of Brexit has been a fall of £90 billion per year, or 4% of GDP. This chart shows the current position for the UK's trading partners. And what you can see at the top here is that the EU now represents less than 50% of all of the UK exports. It's now sending more of its products to non-European Union countries, and the UK's top trading partner in terms of its exports is the United States. It's earning over £60 billion per year from all of the sales into the US. And as I think you'll be aware if you've been following the channel, some of that is now at risk, because if Donald Trump decides that he wants to apply tariffs against all of those imports coming into the USA, then that potentially will hurt that amount of revenue and reduce it going forward. And if we look at which countries other than the USA the UK is dependent upon, Germany is the second largest market, followed by the Netherlands, Ireland and France, which obviously all remain in the European Union. And this chart shows the annual growth in UK GDP dating back to 2013. So if we have a look at what was happening around the time of the Brexit vote, you can see that in 2016 GDP grew at 1.9%. In 2017 it increased to 2.7%. It was 1.4% in 2018 and 1.8% in 2019. Now obviously 2020 was the COVID pandemic, so that affected GDP for all countries around the world. And in 2021 there was a huge bounce back in GDP, because firstly you were measuring it against the poor figures for 2020, and secondly there was a huge increase in demand from everybody coming out of lockdowns. Everybody wanted to go and spend. And so that was an unrepresentative year, where the UK saw growth of 8.6%. In 2022, there was still an element of hangover of all of the enthusiasm from 2021, and GDP grew by 4.8%. However, in 2023, the UK only saw growth of 0.3%, and the latest estimate for 2024 is growth of 0.85%. However, there's a big question mark over that, because if you've been following the channel, you'll know that the UK is currently struggling in terms of achieving any growth at all. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because the impact of Brexit on the UK economy is something that I regularly get asked about. Lots of people saying Brexit has broken Britain, it's destroyed the economy, it was the biggest mistake that the UK could ever have made. Whereas other people are saying Brexit was great, we really support it, we think it's great that the UK is now in control of its own laws and all of its spending, and it doesn't have to contribute all of this billions of pounds every single year to the EU. So in today's video, I wanted to go through some of the data to actually look at what the impact has been on the UK economy. And what we've seen is that, interestingly, some of the things that were talked about at the time of the Brexit vote, particularly immigration and the NHS, I don't think the truth has actually come out in terms of what the impact of Brexit has been. A lot of people who voted for Brexit, I think, were voting on the terms of immigration. They didn't want to see lots and lots of people coming to the UK constantly. But I think that was a misrepresentation of the situation, because all of those immigrants that were shown on that poster with Nigel Farage weren't coming from the European Union. Now, I've actually got no idea where that image was taken from, but it looks like it's refugees. It doesn't look like it's people moving from Germany and France and the Netherlands and Spain and all of the other countries in the EU. So I think the message got a bit mixed in terms of why people were voting for Brexit, what they thought they were going to achieve. But what we saw from the data in today's video is that immigration, since the Brexit deal has been struck and the new immigration laws have been put into place, immigration has actually exploded in the UK. It's now around 3 times higher than it was at the time of the Brexit vote. So anybody that voted for Brexit thinking that it was going to reduce immigration hasn't achieved that goal at all. In fact, immigration is now a lot higher than it was historically. And the other thing that was bandied around a lot at the time of the Brexit vote was that coming out of the European Union would be really good news for the NHS, the National Health Service, because we could then divert all of the money that we were giving to the EU straight to the NHS, and that would improve the service. But as we've seen from the data, there hasn't really been a huge increase in the amount of funding for the NHS. And in fact, in 2024 and 2025, it's estimated to be less than it has been for the previous few years because of the COVID pandemic. So again, if anybody voted for Brexit thinking that they were going to help the NHS, that hasn't really happened. Now, in terms of the big issue, trade. Obviously, leaving the European Union means that the UK no longer benefits from that zero tariff policy that all of the countries operate. And so tariffs are now being applied against UK companies when they're exporting their goods. And as we saw from the data, the amount of goods being exported to the European Union has fallen. And the UK's biggest trading partner is now the USA. So this is sort of what the UK was hoping for when it voted for Brexit. It wanted to change its trading relationships. But the risk that that now represents to the UK economy is that if Donald Trump applies tariffs against all UK exports, that will reduce the amount that those companies are exporting and will hurt the UK economy. So I think the overall summary of today's video is that Brexit, whilst it was done in 2016, which is almost 10 years ago, it's a long time ago, the actual mechanics of it took a long time to take shape because the UK government couldn't get the deal done. It took them until 2020 to actually exit from the EU 3.5 years later. And then we had the COVID-19 pandemic, and then we had Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both of which have had a huge impact on the global economy. So I don't think we've really seen the full long-term benefit or negatives actually feeding through into the economy. But as we saw from the UK government assessment, it's estimated that the overall impact of Brexit has been negative by around £90 billion per year, which is around 4% of GDP. So far, there hasn't really been any major upside. There has been a large increase in immigration, which potentially could be of benefit to the UK over the longer term. And we're not seeing any major benefit from the NHS point of view. So I'll leave you to make your own assessment as to whether or not you think Brexit has been good or bad for the UK. Hopefully the data in today's video will help you make your decision. But if you've liked today's video, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.